Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the day 3 of our annual event, Connect Karo. This session is our 18th Bus Karo event. And today we are going to talk about public-private partnerships to basically scale city bus services. And we have galaxy of speakers, both from India and abroad, who will be talking to us, who will be sharing their experiences, who will be giving us some insight on basically how do you move ahead in scaling public transport. Now, we all know that COVID pandemic has impacted everyone, all the sectors across the country and the geography. But one of the sectors which has been impacted most is the sector of public transport. And one, I think the fear of getting the bug, second, the lockdown, and then the gradual revival. The question for us is, as we move from the survive, revive to the thrive phase, what can we do so as to, one, not only come up to the pre-COVID levels, but in fact surpass the pre-COVID levels, especially in terms of bus operations, supply, usage, and quality as well. So with this as the background, in next 120 odd minutes, we'll be hearing from a galaxy of speakers. But before I start, let me first invite Mr. Surendra Kumar Bagade, who is the Additional Secretary at the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs, to give his keynote address. Over to you, Bagade sir.
Amit, good morning, and good morning to all of the participants. It is always pleasure, meeting the people who are connected with the bus world, in the sense not by the name of the conference, but those who are passionate about making the bus system work in different parts of the world and grow and prosper. So I'm happy that Bus Karo, which is being organized by WRI, is continuing, and this is its 18th edition, and I think that's also a big achievement. Given the importance we accord to bus services, I think it's really remarkable that WRI has continued their efforts, and they continue to support various organizations in the country, including this ministry. So buses and COVID, I think, Amit, before I speak about other things, Amit tried to connect them, and I would say that this connection is at different level in different cities. In Mumbai, we had very strong connection in the sense that during COVID, not a single day went without bus operation. When lockdown was announced, we had before that around 4,000 buses in operation, but on the day one of the lockdown also around 1,600 to 2,000 buses were in operation, and based buses, when the rail system was not working, when other systems had almost come to halt, based was the only transport mode in the country. And so I think I would say that COVID has impacted things differently in different cities. In some cities, the operations were quite reduced, but in Mumbai, we resumed operation at much higher scale also soon after that. And it's the usefulness of the bus system has been proved multiple times, not only in COVID time, but also in like during floods and other problems, when all other modes of transport come to halt, and it's only the bus system which comes to rescue of the city. Now, given that fact that we should have seen our service level rise to a standard which is acceptable not only in the country but like in other parts of the world. We see that generally I have seen, based on our interaction with WRI and Transport for London, that the number of buses per lakh population is much more than 50, which is our service level benchmark 1. And in some state it has crossed, some countries it has crossed 100. So I think if you look at that level in terms of what is available in the country, you would be surprised that the availability of buses is only around 10 or 11 lakh population. And if you consider urban population, even it's like some number maybe 20 or 24. Some cities that 24 is not because every city has higher level. It's only because some cities have very good level and other cities have very dismal level of bus service provisioning, and that's why. So average is not giving the good picture. It's hiding a lot of things which we should not be, speaking. So, and surprisingly, it's not that this service level has remained like that is now, but it has remained like that for years today. And there are people from the industry. I have been working in the bus sector for 4 years, but there are veterans like Prasanna Patwardhan and others, and those who have studied bus provisioning in the country, that this provisioning has remained so low even for many years. And I think that neglect or that lower level of provisioning has impacted development of public transport in different cities. And I would say it has adversely impacted public transport in different cities. Any city you consider, you will see the number of private vehicles which have risen at alarming pace, and also other modes of what you call intermediate, modes of transport. They have also risen in number in a large at large rate. And now you will see that many cities streets are clogged with all intermediate mode and the taxis, and then consequently the buses speed, if at all they are there, has fallen. So what should have been the solution is also seen many times a problem. Like, even if I travel in bus, the speed is going to be very low. So how does it matter? But the problem is not there. The problem is that when the buses number should have increased, no action was taken, or the number has remained so low. No, there was no provisioning, and cities have for many years have not provided adequate level of service, and that has led to all other modes of transport mushroom. They grow in number, and consequently, the bus-based public transport has seen decline, very little support in the city, and very less appetite for it to grow. I see not many cities are very encouraging. We did some experiment in some cities, but not many cities are trying to innovate models, trying to see what will work for provisioning bus services. It's not necessary that we only provide to state-owned organizations. So I think that's a broader issue, and raising it to level at least of service level benchmark 1, which is like 50 buses per lakh population, and then going to higher levels, and at some point trying to be at the level where Western countries have seen their bus services being operated. So now what has happened also happened that the cost of bus operation, be it like Mumbai, be it any city, has also skyrocketed. Our dependence on the manpower and the so-called staff bus ratio has not seen decline, which should have been seen given the increase in the cost. So on one hand, the cost is also rising very rapidly. On the other hand, the ratio is not declining. There are some states which are done very good, some southern where the staff bus ratio is very low, and I think that's a remarkable achievement. So that ratio has not gone down, with the result that the cost of operation has per kilometer basis has gone up so much that any more provisioning is like it's not thought about, because what they have in mind is only that, oh, this is going to cost me 120 rupees per kilometer or 130 rupees per kilometer. I don't have money for that much costly provisioning of service. But people don't. We need to also understand why it is like that, where our inefficiencies are hidden. and how these inefficiencies can be removed from the system, and can this inefficiency, if addressed, will lead to reduction in cost, and with the limited budget of the cities and the state, will it increase the provisioning of service? I think that's what the issue should be discussed, and that is what Bus Karo and WRI and other experts should focus on, how to induce efficiency in bus operation. There is a PPP model which we are thinking about, which we talked about. There are many variants of that. Still, one of the major cost is ticket collection. And we experimented some models in Mumbai for ground booking. That's not as efficient as Western countries where there is no conductor, and the people wait patiently for getting into the bus. They pay through card, like London, where the payment is entirely through card. There is no other mode of payment. So I think those modes, when you are innovating, it's not only the model, but it's a very fundamental change required in the way we are operating the buses. And I think that ticket collection, conductor. Now, who employs the conductor? How much trust we can put into others who are on short-term contract basis? All those questions are there, and I think we have to weigh the cost of having our own staff versus loss in revenue if we adopt other models. And I think that loss, is it much more than what we can gain by by having our own? No. So I think these are the broader issues on which we need to think and make the experiment work. There are some cities which have adopted this model of outsourcing entire staff, including conductor, and I think they are doing fine. It's only our change of mindset that we need to also start looking at what other cities have done. So I think that, along with PPP model of bus operation, will also very fundamental to making the entire bus sector good. Because if that issue is not addressed, it will still be the sector will be still hobbled by the higher cost of ticket collection. And I think that we need to address right in the beginning. And as we discuss triple P model, I think that component should also be there. And I will urge WRI to engage with various cities for understanding how we can make this thing happen, and how we can entirely automate ticket collection through proper automatic fare collection system. Now, given this, we cannot let this state of affairs to continue. We need to address this issue. We need to make our cities have adequate level of public transport. We need to look at how funding can be provided, which will support the cities which are eager to adopt and increase level of public, bus-based public transport, but they are somehow not able to do, either because there are not enough funds or there are not proper structures created. So I think that is what ministry is working on, and you all know that Honorable Finance Minister has announced a scheme in the budget that we will be also supporting various cities for acquiring buses. You will be happy that this is going to be triple P model, public-private partnership model. We believe that triple P model will bring in efficiencies into the sector, will cut down the cost, and make provisioning of service possible. So I think that's why the ministry is working on this model. We are working with various cities of how to support them, and the support is not like one time. In earlier our experiences that we know that once you provide support one time by providing a bus, then you can see it operate in operation for a few months, but for rest of the time you can see it standing in the depots. So based on our learning, what we have decided is that not only just with triple P model, but the funding will be over a period of longer time, so that we see bus operation every quarter, every day, and cities and states and the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs together will evolve a framework in which we can work on service level benchmarks, so that they are driven more by cities. We have some stake in that, but we would like finances to be tied up to provision of services continuously for all the duration of the contract. So I think that's what the ministry is looking at. Ministry is also looking at how we can enable the cities which are small to adopt technology-based things. I think that also is very important. Unless there is adoption of technology in automating the operations, we will not be able to cut down our stop bus ratio. So I think these are some of the areas in which we are very keenly working. We are working with WRI, other cities, different ministries in the government of India, making it possible to adopt the model. I'm also very happy that I see Sashi here. There are some private operators who have been in the sector for a long time, and I see Mr. Derio from, I think he's from Peru or Bogota, Colombia. From where?
In Bogota, Colombia. Yes.
So I think I always see him, and I feel happy that proper designing of bus system can entirely revolutionize how people move in the city. And I think efficiency with which citizens move in the city is surely very important indicator for the economic development of our cities. So I am here to hear more and speak less, because I think we are still learning. But I think the next frontier I see is there is some adoption of PPP model, but this ticketing system is, I see is a major issue. And what technologies we can bring, I don't know what kind of ticketing system they have in Bogota. I would especially like to learn how they have, because I think if you can address this issue and we are ready to support that model experimentation, I think we'll be really cutting down cost substantially. And therefore, this also will be very important for us. I'm happy that WRI has been supporting us and has been organizing conference year after year. PPP model will continue to be very significant player in future. I think we need more cities to adopt it, but we also need, like a toolkit, which we have seen in cities like Mumbai, Delhi, some part for electric buses, some cities have adopted, and those systems are working. I think DIMS has been contributing much about evolution of that tender document, agreement, and all that. I think that toolkit also, which ministry will be working on, but we also need everybody to contribute to that toolkit so that it becomes easier for the cities to design proper contracts. I think with that, I would stop here. I wish great success. I'm here. I'm not leaving, but I would like to listen and speak later. Thank you. Thank you very much, Amit. And good to see you, Sashi and Prasanna. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Bagade. And we are so excited to hear that the ministry is actively working on coming up with a new bus funding scheme. And also that you are not looking at just one-time support, but a slightly longer time support, so that buses are not only bought, but maybe they are operated in cities. So very excited to hear. And we hope that the scheme will come out soon. So once again, thanks a lot for the wonderful insight. So people who are listening to this presentation, this session, one is that if you have any questions, please use the Q&A box to type in your questions. We will try to take this question with the respective speakers. So yeah, on the right-hand side, you will see a Q&A box wherein you can type the questions. So yeah. Okay, so let's move forward. And before I ask some of the eminent speakers to come and share their experience, let's first set the context right. Mr. Bagla did give us some number, but let me ask my colleague Revati to make a quick presentation to just set the context right for us to kickstart to the next session. Over to you, Revati.
Thank you so much, Amit. Let me just share my screen. I hope my screen is visible.
Yes, Revati. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. So, yeah, I just want to set the context to start with about the road-based transport, about the bus-based transport in India today. If we all know, currently passenger kilometers, in terms of passenger kilometers, the road sector enables 85% of the total passenger kilometers in India. In this, almost 85% is done by bus-based transport. But if we look at the vehicle registration trends, almost 87% is by cars and two-wheelers, that is private vehicles. And currently the mode share of sustainable transport modes such as buses is less than 1%. But if we look at, so that means definitely there is demand, but in terms of mode share, it has fallen over the years. And in terms of bus transport, it is done by both public as well as private sectors. But since private sector transport is more fragmented and their roles are not clearly defined, often this is predominantly done by STUs or publicly owned systems such as municipal undertakings and special purpose vehicles in India. Speaking of STUs, in India, almost currently our STUs together own about 1,40,000 buses. The issue here is the growth of the fleet has been close to about 2%, while the passenger demand has grown at about 15%, which means we still have a huge passenger demand, but lack of supply and in terms of fleet. Within this fleet, almost 64% is among the 9 mega cities in India, which caters to roughly 24% of the urban population. So that means our mega cities have a slightly better bus transport, but while the smaller cities have minimal to no bus transport systems. So if we are talking about deficit in terms of investment for the bus transport currently, it stands at 2 places. First is the fleet. We need almost 1.4 lakh buses. We have almost 1.4 lakh buses, which is 3 times what we, almost 1/3 of what we need. Second is financial. STUs do have a huge gap between earnings and the expenditure of the transport. We need almost the cost recovery right now is 47%, which really limits the investment in terms of technological advancement for the STUs. As per our studies, we need almost 1.5 lakh crore investment in bus transport area by 2031. Now, talking about the bus operations in India, we have public-owned, private-owned, operated, and PPP models. We tried to map about 53 cities in India. This is just to give an idea that mostly all our operations is done by STUs. And our STUs per se have the limitations because they are regulated by the certain issues. First is that it is still regulated by the Road Transport Corporation Act of 1950, which keeps the complete onus of planning, operating, and maintenance of bus fleet on the state. And it also, the use of technology is not limited in terms of fare connection, planning, and operation. The large gap between the revenue and cost of operations. While if you look at international examples of growth in terms of bus transport over the past decades, in terms of infrastructure, fleet, operation, and other areas, the transport has largely changed. If you look at infrastructure, we have bus, multimodal integration happening, bus-based in terms of improvement of bus transport. And even in terms of fleet, we have articulated bus fleet, we have GPS enabled bus fleet, and also numerous cities have been moving to cleaner fuel options. And in terms of technological advancements, we have seen electronic ticketing move to mobile ticketing and smart cards, which we anticipate in India soon. The area that we really expect India to move on and our cities to move on to is the PPP model of operation and to tap into the non-fare box revenue streams. Talking about PPP, it is just to put the idea out there. It is a contract or concession-based agreement where there is a company bound to deliver essential services at a contract payment of user charges. It can be done by both GCC as well as NCC model. It is just the difference in the financial risk that lies on the private or public sector. This really redefines the roles played by public sector or STUs, or they can really move on to a regulatory-based regulatory role once a PPP model comes in. Now, PPP model does not have to be limited in terms of just operation. We can also look at their participation in building our bus fleets that we see in cities like Indore, Surat, Ahmedabad, where they helped the city to procure, own, and operate the buses. This really minimizes the capital load on the state. Second is in terms of infrastructure. We can use the PPP model to develop and maintain the depot, where the concessionaire gets a certain, whatever revenue he gives, it returns and collects and returns a certain fare to the municipality. We can also tap into PPP for operation or technological support, and also to increase the technical capacity of the city. So these are a few areas that we look forward that PPP can be engaged in terms of cities to progress their city bus transport. And I really look forward to today's discussion. Now, talking about the learnings of PPP operations within India, we have seen a few learnings from the past experience. First is need for integrated route planning. We need to help, this will really help improve the ridership and revenue income. Two things regarding the infrastructure and staffing. First is that the PPP or the operator needs to be, from the state side, it needs to receive the depot or the infrastructure timely delivered, and the staffing at SPV really significantly help improve the planning and monitoring of services. Other areas that can be looked into and improved are the revenue models, monitoring and payment systems, and improvement of technical capacity of the both public as well as private sector agencies. Thank you, everyone. That is my time, and I would like to hand over to Amrit to take the session forward.
Thanks a lot, Revati. One, for highlighting the need for public transport system, and second, also highlighting some key learnings that we have got from India, especially looking at public-private partnership in bus operation. So with this as a background, let's move forward and let's hear about two international case studies. The first one would be presented by Mr. Dario Hidalgo, who is the Executive Director at Fundación Despacio. Dario, I know it's midnight in Bogota, and I hope you are awake, and we really look forward to your presentation. So over to you, Dario.
Thank you very much, Amit. And I am no longer with Fundación Despacio. I'm an independent researcher and consultant based in Bogota. And I really like to keep this contact with India and provide some insights of what's going on in Latin America. So I'm very happy to join this presentation today. As part of the WRI and as support to WRI, I was member of a team of researchers that look into the issue of informal and semi-formal services in Latin America and the transport reform that is happening in many places around the region. We have this report that it's available from the Inter-American Development Bank, which provides insights of what is going on in terms of changing what is the rule in many countries in the region. These small vehicles, privately owned, but very unregulated, with very different than the STUs in India, that provide most of the public transportation services in the region. And they have some advantages and some issues behind. And what cities in Latin America have been doing is trying to transform these operations into a better scheme, which works better for the city, better for the users, and better also to the private providers that that are giving this service. They come in very different shapes and sizes and names across the Latin American region, from large buses to small vehicles, taxi type vehicles, which have very positive outcomes in one way. In terms of very ubiquitous, they are everywhere. They are very affordable, especially for low-income population. They are very adaptive to the user needs, but and on the good side, they also help the government in a way, because government doesn't need to be there to provide the service, because it is privately provided. That don't require this viability gap and managing fair collection systems and fair evasion. And on the operator side, they don't require large capacity, large investment, and drivers they get an income out of it. But they have very negative side. In terms of the users, is mainly poor quality services. In terms of government, the very difficult issues that cities have in terms of congestion, pollution, traffic fatalities, and issues. And in terms of the operators, it is not able to really to scale up, to create a continuous service. They face a lot of issues in terms of the financial opportunity to continue to do the service. And for the drivers, there are not very good conditions in terms of the labor conditions, in terms of a real decent living out of it. So it has positives, but has many negatives. So indeed, that's the reason governments in Latin America have been trying to transportation integration and formalization of these services, to be able to improve, to be able to change and modernize public transportation in the Latin American cities. And this requires increased responsibility both on the public sector and on the private sector to be able to make these systems happen and provide good quality services. So in the report, we have case studies from many places in the region, from Dominican Republic, from Santiago in Chile, many places in my country, Colombia, in Sao Paulo, Brazil, in Mexico City, a case study on services that are use apps and modern fleet to provide services, and also in the smaller cities in my country. You can look at the paper directly on how we learn about these different experiences. I will like to share a little bit more of what is going on in Bogota, in Colombia. And in Bogota, we implemented in 2000 a system called Transmilenio, which is a large-scale bus rapid transit system, which changed completely public transportation in the city of Bogota. It is part of a larger scheme of integrated transport. The city of Bogota currently is, at 20 years later, is building its first metro line. Bogota is a large city in terms of Latin America. We are more about 8 million people here, but it's not as large as the very large cities, mega cities in India. Still, the system is designed for the conditions of Bogota, and it's a PPP, public-private partnership scheme, in which the city provided the infrastructure, the bus lanes, the stations, the management, and the private sector provided the buses and the fare collection and the operation of the system. And it came with really, really large benefits to the city in terms of travel time savings, reductions in emission, reductions in traffic deaths and injuries. The benefits concentrated on the poor, on the on the edges of the city where most of the low-income population lives, providing most benefits to low-income population, dignify the labor, because with the new formalized scheme, the operators were no longer working extended hours, and it required a lot of institutional strengthening, and it was a low-cost, rapid implementation scheme. But unfortunately, over time, the service has declined, and for reasons more related to governance and decision making at the city level, which has not provided the continuous support the system required over time. The city attempted, and it's implementing the expansion of this system starting in 2012 without providing the infrastructure. It's providing the contracts and the operations on a very similar system than the BRT that started 20 years ago, but without the infrastructure. And the operations require a viability gap, which is extensive for the city, that doesn't take advantage of the opportunities of the BRT. It has not provided the quality that the citizens of the city deserve and will like to see, but the scheme has been able to modernize the full fleet of the whole city, including a very large fleet of electric buses. Without this public-private partnership scheme, it was not possible for the private operators on their own to modernize the fleet. So it was a very important issue in the city of Bogota. Fleet modernization came with this new scheme of public-private partnership. And during the pandemic, we had a really big hit in terms of reducing the demand for these services. Almost the demand during 2020 dropped 50%. It is still low in 2021. We are coming over right now. We are recovering very well, but during the first semester of 2021, the issue was very big. But without having the system in place, it was not possible to keep public transportation provision for the citizens. But this required a large gap to be covered with government subsidies during these difficult years of 2020 and 2021. We expect this will reduce in 2022, but the gap between revenues and cost was double during the pandemic. But the system kept going, which was the most important part of it. It was possible to keep service running, which was critical for essential workers and for low-income workers in the city during the critical times of the pandemic. As a conclusion, you can look into the report for the transformation in the city, and we don't think that there is a single pathway to improve transit, but we learn from these experiences in Latin America that this comes at a cost. It's not a free lunch. You need to provide some, not just the institutional capacity, but some funding to be able to make these systems happen. If options are limited, working with the informal sector could be an option, but we are talking today about formalized public transport systems, which in the case of Bogota and also in the case of Santiago, provided a pathway to improve quality of service, especially renewing the bus fleets and getting integrated fare collection systems in place. And the experience that we have in Latin America with public operators, with STUs, it's very mixed. It's more negative than positive. Public undertakings tend to start fine, but management quality decline over time and the cost escalate. because of bureaucracy, because of corruption, unfortunately, and because changes in priorities of the managers. But public-private partnerships have been able to keep going without increasing too much the cost to the cities and the citizens. And it was critical for the bus fleet renewal, especially for the introduction of zero emission, zero tailpipe emission buses in the cities of Santiago and Bogota and in other places. I will be ready for questions during the panel, but I'm very, very happy to be able to continue working and talking with Indian authorities on ways to improve public transportation.
Thanks a lot, Dario, for this wonderful presentation, and also kind of clearly highlighting at least the experience in Colombia with public sector operations. So thanks a lot for this presentation. We will now move forward, and I would now request Mr. Shashi Verma, who is the Director of Strategy and Chief Technology Officer at Transport for London, to share his example, his experience on public-private partnership with bus operations in London. Over to you, Mr. Verma.
Thank you, Amit, and good morning, everyone. It's a bright and early morning. As you can see, the sun is still rising here. I'm not going to share slides. I won't bore you with PowerPoint, but let me just make a few points about what we have done in London, my observations of what we've done in India, and actually over the last 5 years, we've done quite a lot of work in India that has translated into the program that the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs is now taking forward under the PPP model. So let me just describe our analysis of what we've learned out of all of that. And also, I think the challenges that lie ahead in a successful implementation of that kind of program. So just briefly, so London is a city of about 9 million people, about 90 lakhs. There are many comparable cities in India. You look at Bangalore, it's about 1 crore 20 lakhs. So there are other comparable cities that you can find in India as well. But if you look at London's public transport system, we have about 1,000 kilometers of metros in London alone. And that's more than the entire metro kilometers in all of India put together. Right? So I think that context is really important. There's a very high metro density in London, which doesn't exist anywhere in India. But on top of that, there are 9,000 buses in London, of which 3/4 are double deckers. So if you actually take the effective bus capacity, we have roughly about 15 or 16,000 buses operating in London in a city of 90 lakh people, right? So it's important to put that context that we have 1,000 kilometers of metros and we have 16,000 buses serving a city of 90 lakh people. That is why when you come to London, you see the public transport system working and everybody thinks, can I have one of those? But that's the effort it takes. And it's important to realize that without that level of provision, you're not going to see the public transport experience that people desire. Right? So there's no shortcut to this. What's also important is that despite having 1,000 kilometers of metros, there are more bus journeys that are made in London than there are journeys on the underground. And that is also important to realize because the answer is not metros alone. You can keep building metros as long as you want. The answer will still lie in buses. And the reason I'm making this point is that my observation of what's happened in India over the last 50, 60, 70 years is that for a very long time, we were shy of making infrastructure investments. And therefore, the way cities grew is that you build a road network, people get their own private vehicles, and then the city keeps on expanding. And that model worked when people's incomes were lower and there were very few private vehicles in use. But as income started to increase in the 1980s and 1990s, private vehicle use started to expand. And we are seeing the effect of that with the road network being completely choked because of a lack of provision of public infrastructure. Now, the response in India, starting in the 1990s, was to flip completely to the other side and pick up the most expensive infrastructure we could find, which is metros. And a lot of investment is going in metros. And frankly, I have nothing against metros. That investment is needed and will carry on being needed for a very long time. Where I have a problem is the assumption that metros were the solution. So metros are an important ingredient to the solution, but they're not the solution to the public transport problem by themselves. And that effect is being seen in India right now. Delhi is the prime example of that. 400 odd kilometers, 500 kilometers of metros in Delhi now. Congestion is only worse compared to what it was 20 years ago. right? And that problem of solving the congestion and having a good quality of life cannot be solved by metros. That that experience is vividly available in Delhi right now. So the next question we have to ask is, why is it that we've not been able to solve the bus problem? Now, part of it is that they're not seen as being very attractive. They are seen as the poor people's transport. They're not attractive. They don't provide the shiny infrastructure or the ribbon cutting opportunities that politicians desire. Therefore, to an extent, they're relegated to the background. But there is a different reason which is more important, which is that the delivery of any public project is difficult. We know that. We know that from experience. The capacity of the state to deliver anything is limited. But over time, we have developed some techniques on capital infrastructure. So if you look at Mahua, over time, the whole process by which metros are built has been honed down, and there is a successful model for metro delivery in India right now, which we should be very proud of, by the way. Not every country has that experience, so we should be very proud of the fact that successful model of metro delivery exists in India. Likewise, in North, there is the useful example of how to build highways, right? And that also has taken a long time to develop, but it works successfully now. North is churning out highways, year after year after year, very successfully. So the model of how to develop capital infrastructure is to an extent there. The problem with buses is buses are not about capital infrastructure. What is required to make buses successful is a successful service delivery model. It is fundamentally a service delivery problem. And unfortunately, we don't have that service delivery model yet that works successfully in a scalable manner in India. And that's why we keep getting into the problem. Revati talked earlier about the mandate to the state transport undertakings. That's absolutely true, but state transport undertakings have a mandate to run transport for the state. Not surprisingly, they find the intercity market to be more profitable, and that's where they focus. The urban transport market has never been profitable. It's not profitable in any city around the world. And unless there is a mandate to deliver urban buses, the state transport undertakings don't do anything about it. So when you look at where urban buses have been delivered successfully, Delhi, Mumbai, Bangalore, Chennai, it's all being done because there is a dedicated urban bus transport organization, whether that's the DTC in Delhi or DIMS in Delhi or BEST in Mumbai. That's the reason why these cities have urban public transport. If you go to other cities, you go to, even in Maharashtra, you go to Nashik, the delivery of urban public transport is done by the STU. You might find a bus from time to time, but the level of provision is very inadequate. You go to other states where it's left entirely to the STUs, you won't find a bus in sight anywhere in the urban area. That's the problem that we need to crack here. Now, coming back to the experience of London. So we've had bus services in London for 200 years. Initially, they were all private. Starting in 1933, they started getting nationalized. And from 1948 onwards, they were entirely nationalized. Now, the same problems that exist in India were available to see in London as well. Poor provision, inadequate investment, poor service. Sometimes the buses run, sometimes they don't run. All the issues that we see with managing staff, managing maintenance of buses and all that, they were all rife in London in the 1980s. But we took the decision in 1985, and that's how long back it was, to change that model and start accepting private provision of public buses. And what you call the PPP model is basically the franchised model of bus service in London that has been developed since 1985. And essentially for about the last 20 years, all buses in London have been run under that franchise system. In fact, Transport for London, as the Integrated Transport Authority, is responsible for the provision of bus services in London, but we haven't actually run a bus for about 15 or 20 years. So it's entirely privately delivered and very successfully. So over the last 5 years, as we've been working with Morth and Mahua and Niti Aayog and others in developing this bus model for India, that's the model that we're suggesting. It is a model that can be translated very successfully into India. But there are some critical ingredients for success. And that's what I want to point out here in a public forum, because these, in the absence of these ingredients, success is not guaranteed. In fact, success is not possible. So fundamentally, a franchise bus model or a PPP bus model works if the incentive structure on all parties are right, and each party is willing to fulfill their role in that incentive structure. If any party is unwilling to fulfill their role in the incentive structure, then frankly, this model doesn't work. And I have to tell you, despite the claim being that the private sector is inefficient and all that, the worst participant in this is the government. Because the biggest problem that you get with PPP contracts or franchise contracts is the inability or unwillingness of the state to pay up once the service has been delivered, right? That fundamentally is at the heart of the problem that needs to be cracked, right? We can talk about route planning and all that. That's not why these models fail. The models fail because the operator has delivered the service and the state doesn't want to pay. And we'll find any number of reasons why the contract wasn't fulfilled and therefore won't be paid, right? So that is at the heart of the problem that needs to be cracked. But just stepping back from that a little bit, fundamentally, this is a model in which the state sets out the requirements for the bus service it wants. Our view is that it should set it out on the basis of, a route, a timetable, and so on, not on the basis of you will run 200 kilometers, right? It's very easy to come up with a mechanism that says, come and run 200 kilometers and we'll pay you for 200 kilometers. The problem is that unless you allocate where those 200 kilometers are going or how they're being used, how you're going to monitor the delivery of 200 kilometers, or indeed what output you're getting from it, then frankly, that's a lazy contract and it's rife for failure. The way we do it is we set out a timetable, we set out routes, we set out timetables, and we set out quality parameters on that timetable. So for example, timeliness, cleanliness of the bus, and so on. And the contract that is set out requires the operator to deliver against those parameters. And if they deliver against those parameters, they get paid. So there's a very critical thing here about what is it that you're asking the private sector to deliver. And it has to be specific to the output that you're trying to deliver, not some shorthand metric of kilometers per day. The second bit, which is really critical here, is how do you keep the system from going into disputes? And therefore, what's required is a relatively independent mechanism for verifying whether the contractual commitments have been delivered. Now, a lot of the contractual commitments are about service provision and timeliness and so on that are capable of being measured through technology. This is where the role of a good ITS system comes in. So again, an ITS system is not just putting GPS in a bus. That's just the start. An ITS system consists of all the backroom, all the back office paraphernalia that's needed to translate that GPS signal into whether the contract was actually delivered or not. That is the key to what the ITS system has to deliver. So the way we do it, again, is that we have all these programs running in the background which take the GPS signal from buses, but they're translating that through a huge series of steps into the payment that needs to be made to the private operator. And because it's being done through a verifiable ITS system, at the end of the day, there's very little scope for dispute about whether the service was delivered to the quality that was required or not, right? And this is why a core ITS system is needed. And frankly, it's the same system that every city is going to need in India. So our suggestion to the government was that this is one that the central government should deliver and make it freely available to every city to use, rather than every city going and hacking it. The problem that we get with technology is that because technology is expensive, every city wants to do it on the cheap. And you end up with a substandard system that's not verifiable to the standards that I'm asking that we should have. And the reality is that if one city can build it, or if the central government can build it, that system is basically essentially what every other city is going to need. So that kind of verification mechanism has to be there. And the third is that there has to be some dispute resolution mechanism. If we rely upon any disputes on payments to go through the court system, then frankly, that system doesn't work in India. And again, in our system, we have a system of arbitration. Anything that goes through it, frankly, we don't have disputes to start off with because this is all done through the ITS system and it doesn't result in disputes. But if there is a dispute, there is an arbitration mechanism where disputes can be resolved within 28 days. Right? And that is a critical ingredient, again, of making these systems successful. Now, if you step back from that, there is the big question of how do you keep the system economically whole? Mr. Bagli mentioned this earlier, but let me just emphasize it again. Right? So again, the distinction between spending money on capital is you think you can spend the money upfront and then you have nothing to do for the rest of your life, which, by the way, is a fallacy, as we're seeing with the metros as well, because they're all making losses, they all require subsidies, There has to be this ongoing support system for metros. But it is a much bigger issue with buses, where there is very little upfront capital infrastructure, and therefore people think you can do it on the cheap. But there is a viability gap. That is the whole reason why urban buses are not viable, right? And there has to be a mechanism to address the viability gap on an ongoing basis. So step one is to try and reduce the viability gap to as little as possible, and that's partly by private participation, but partly by proper fare setting as well. But to keep it going year after year, there has to be a mechanism for fare setting year after year that recognizes the fact that costs go up. No politician wants to raise fares. It's the same story worldwide. It's the same story that every city has to solve. But the fact is costs go up every year. So there have to be some set mechanisms by which fares can go up every year to recognize the cost increase and therefore keep the system whole. That's a very critical part of it. But the other part of it is that you are still left with a viability gap, and there has to be an identified source of tax revenue or state support that is dedicated to providing a support for buses. And you can't make this reliant upon, we'll make something up every year in the budget. Because the reality is that, you can do that for 1 or 2 years and then people lose support. This is essentially what Dario was saying has happened in Bogota as well. It all starts off with great fanfare, and then people lose interest in it, stop providing support, the quality declines, and the whole thing goes into disrepute. And we need to watch out for that and make sure that that doesn't happen. Now, there's one final thing which was not part of our report to the government, but I think is absolutely critical to making buses successful. So all that I've talked about is how to make a PPP model successful. But if you elevate yourself from that, there is one further thing that's required to make buses successful, which is that, as Revati pointed out in her presentation as well, this is by far the most efficient way of allocating road space. You look at Bangalore. I mean, I have the Bangalore statistics to mind, so I can give it to you. Right? There's something like 6 or 7 million private vehicles in Bangalore. They carry about half the traffic. There are 6,000 buses that carry the other half of the traffic, right? And yet people say there is no space for buses. Now, there's no space for 6,000 vehicles, but we're willing to make space for 6 million vehicles, right? And if you only cut the 6 million vehicles down to, forget about cutting the 6 million vehicles down to anything. If you increase the buses from 6,000 to 12,000, but you provided space for them, proper bus lanes, properly enforced, make the economics of the bus network work to your advantage. If buses go faster, they're cheaper to run. And you can make them faster by dedicating road space to buses, recognizing the fact that they're more efficient in terms of their utilization of road space than any other mode of transport that's on the roads. That is a key political decision that's needed. It's not going to happen by just mandating it across the country. There have to be some pilot projects that demonstrate the advantage of having proper bus lanes. And when you build bus lanes, flood those lanes with buses. I think one of the mistakes that's been made with BRTs in India is that you dedicate a BRT corridor and there are hardly any buses on it, and everybody else looks at it and says, I'm sitting in traffic and there are no buses, and so why has the space been dedicated to buses? You don't see that in London. You see that where there are bus lanes, you see buses very frequently on those routes. Just outside where I live, there are 4 bus routes. There is a bus lane, but there is a bus on those bus routes literally every minute. I mean, the frequency on my route is, as I said, there are 4 bus routes. Each one of them has a 3 to 4 minute frequency. So on average, we are running a bus more than once every minute. That's the level of provision that you need to get the public support to allocate road space. So there's a lot to be done. I'm really glad that MOVA has taken this forward. I'm really glad that the finance minister set aside some money for this. And I really hope that this turns out to be successful. I'm just pointing out that the road ahead is paved with lots of difficulties. This is not easy to deliver, but if it is delivered, it will be the most transformational thing that gets done in India in terms of transport. It will be, believe it or not, it will be more transformational than all the metros and all the roads that have been built, because it will solve the whole quality of life problem in cities. Thank you, Amit. I'll hand this back to you.
Thanks a lot, Shashi, for this wonderful presentation on London. So we've got some quick questions. Maybe I'll just ask you to quickly respond. Dario, one question to you is, what's the regulatory framework for bus operation in Bogota? And can you tell a little bit more about the trust fund that is there?
Yes, well, the city by itself manages the public transportation system. It's very decentralized. It's not the state government, it's not the national government, it's the city government that manages the public transportation system. And it has a dedicated agency, which is called Transmilenio, which is trusted with all the planning and oversight of the PPP contracts that are provided regularly for the trunk services and for the local services in the city. The regulatory framework includes that the user fare is set up by the local authority, and whatever gap is there needs to be covered with the city budget. It is not possible just to run the service without the budget to provide for that viability gap. So every now and then the city runs contract bidding processes to contract the service provision, and the service provision has a long contract of conditions that need to be met, and the city agency Transmilenio is the oversight agency for meeting these contracts, to making the private operator to comply with these contracts. And if there's no compliance, some of these contracts are stopped, and the city needs to replace this contractor with new ones, and that's kind of there are many good examples from the franchise model in London that have been adopted in the case of Bogota to be able to provide the service. So quality is measured, and the goal of the city agency is to continue upgrading the quality for the users.
Thanks a lot, Dario. Sashi, two questions, a quick reply. One is, what do you see as a key legal or regulatory change that will unlock the model that you described? So that's one question. The second question is, you mentioned about payment. What's the structure in place in London so that the operators get paid on a timely basis?
Right. But I think in terms of the legal and regulatory change, first thing, I don't think very much is needed to start introducing private buses into the framework, right? I mean, that already exists, and actually exists in cities like Delhi, where, I've been helping DIMCs for about 15 years, and frankly, they've shown that this model can be made to work. So the broad regulatory framework is already there. I think the one place where the regulatory framework has to change is around dispute resolution, and I'm emphasizing that point because it absolutely is critical. These systems, I mean, all public procurement in India falls into disrepute because the state does not want to pay. And this is, when we did all the work, we spoke to Prasanna, we spoke to many of his colleagues, we spoke to many bus operators in India. And the number one thing that comes out, and by the way, they may not be open about saying this very directly to the government because, of their relationship with government, but I can say it quite bluntly, right? It is absolutely a fact that the number one complaint that they have is that we provide the service, we don't get paid. And you can't run a system with that level of distrust. So that is, the dispute resolution is one place, whether that's done through setting up an arbitration panel or setting up a regulatory authority, as has been done in the case of the electricity industry, for example. There are other models that we can learn from other industries, but that dispute resolution mechanism has to definitely be there. Talking about London, so I said, the dispute resolution mechanism is an arbitration system here, where disputes that get referred there get solved in, there is a time-bound adjudication in 28 days. There is, and that provides a lot of comfort to the private operators who work for us. But I mentioned earlier that, we don't get to the point where things go into dispute. And that is because of a very successful, very clear, verifiable ITS system. And that is at the heart of this success, that there's an ITS system that all parties can trust. Now, to be clear, when I say perfect, no system is ever perfect. There are days when, a bus goes out, the ITS system is working, but something happens and it stops working. Or, for whatever reason, it's worked for part of the route, not worked for other parts of the route. And there's a collaborative process to say, look, something has happened because of which gap filling is needed. And, we talked through when we were doing this work with the government of India, we talked through exactly what we do. So this is, I'm getting to a level of detail. 99.9% of the data is there, but it's important to fill in that remaining 0.1%. And the reason it's important is that bus operators are working on margins of 2-3%, right? Now, 99.9% may look very perfect to you, but that 0.1% should be compared against 2 or 3% of their margins. So suddenly you're talking about 3% of their margins being dropped out if you're not able or willing to fill the gaps. And it also leaves bad blood that the service was provided, the system didn't work, and now you're not willing to pay me because the system didn't work. So there has to be a willingness on the part of all sides to respect the integrity of the contractual framework and not get into disputes just because you have some grounds to get into a dispute.
Thanks a lot, Shashi. And thanks a lot, Garya, for the wonderful insight. So let's move forward. We will now move to the panel discussion. And we have a great panel who has joined us. So we have Manjula Madam. She's the Commissioner at ULT Karnataka. Sanyam Gandhi, who's the Director at Chartered Speed, is with us. Prasanna Patwardar, CMD of Prasanna Purple, is with us. Mr. Gautam Patel, Principal Consultant at Coordinates Consultant, he is with us. Raghavendra D, Head of Sales and Marketing in Ashok Leyland. Vivek Chandran, Associate Director at Shakti Sustainable Energy Foundation, as well as Rupa Nandi, who will be joining shortly from the UITP. So, ladies and gentlemen, one you heard initially from Mr. Bagade on government's thinking. We also saw a presentation by Revati, which looked at some of the key numbers from India. And then we heard two very fascinating case studies from Bogota as well as London. So let me start by asking your initial remarks on this topic on PPP in bus operation. And maybe we'll start with Manjula ma'am. Manjula ma'am, if you're online.
Yeah, thank you, Amit. I'm there, right. So, sorry, I just joined a bit late, but I saw the presentations that were made. I think we in Karnataka are very sure that bus will continue to be the prime mover of people, despite the fact that in Bangalore, we are investing on metro as well as suburban rail. And in the course of time, we would have 320 odd kilometers of mass transit. But we do see, despite that, bus has to be given priority. That said, what we are working on in recent times is to, kind of provide the bus priority through providing them bus lanes. And as it has been mentioned, it's not just sufficient to have more buses or ITS. We need to also give the space to buses. 34 kilometers of bus priority lane is already in operation in Bengaluru. Another 70 odd kilometers, we are at various stages. Which we hope to be taking up shortly. The target is to reach 200 kilometers in the next few years. So we are looking at opportunities of how we could do road dieting and ensure space is given to buses, because we do foresee that despite all the investment that one is making, bus will continue to provide the linkages between the mass transit, that is metro and suburban and so on. The second point I wanted to mention is that there is already a thinking, and government has already earmarked certain, announced certain taxes. The amount from which is going to flow into a Bangalore Urban Transport Fund, which of course is not going to be just dedicated only to buses, but it is supposed to be used for, improving public transport infrastructure. Also with respect to, implementing TOD and improving walkability, cyclability, and so on. So we hope to see it, soon. This is already orders are issued. We are in the stages of operationalizing it. So point I want to make is that Karnataka has been one of the front runners in investing on public transport. And as many may be aware, BMTC, the bus services in Bangalore, started in 1940s. And at some point, I think middle of 2012, 2013, we had only 8 cities which had organized a city bus transport system. But over a period of time, we have invested using or leveraging our state urban transport fund. And we have today 22 odd cities where we do have the public transport. Now, our experience has been mostly with the, Amit, are you saying something? I can't, So our experience has been that we have all these city organized transport services in all cities are run by the government. the government undertakings. So as you are aware, we have four major undertakings along, and BMTC is another one. So we can say we have 5. And in the last few years, we have added another, which is Hubli Dharwad BRTS company, by implementing the first bus rapid transit system in the entire Karnataka, which is functioning very well, apart from the impact of COVID-19, etc., which is really functioning very well. And therefore, the focus is always on bus transport. If you are asking us about the PPP, I would say that our experience with PPP has been very limited somehow in urban transport. Because over a period of all these years, while we kept on investing on public transport, it is always through the government systems. So somehow we have not had that experience like in some cities like Ahmedabad, etc., where probably they never had a city transport government bus service, and therefore they had to look towards private operators to come in. So our experience has been very limited with respect to the PPP, but we are interested in further strengthening our bus systems, not just in Bengaluru, also in the 2-tier cities. As I mentioned, the 22 cities that I spoke of, there are cities with only 1 lakh population, 50,000 population, because we feel unless we invest and put in buses, how many would be dependent on the population of that city? We need to start investing on it now itself. Unless we do so, we can't wait and say, okay, when congestion happens, when cities become so untenable, like in case of Bangalore, then we will start investing. That's not the idea at all, so far as in Karnataka is concerned. So we have invested even in smaller cities. So first, the question I have is that because we have not had the experience, I really do not know how would the PPP function in our scenario, especially in smaller 2-tier cities where we do want to focus more on going in future, because after all, apart from Bangalore, other cities also need investments and so on. That is something which one has to see. The other point here is that sometimes in Indian context, PPPs have not worked. There could be a variety of reasons. One case in point is that the Delhi airport, metro link, which was started on a PPP basis, and then after some time the PPP partner withdrew and it didn't work. Now there could be very many reasons for that, and as the previous speakers have mentioned, we need to look at, first we need to sort out that reasons, and if you don't have proper transparency in contracting processes, procurement processes, and the contracts are not properly spelled out, and we don't internalize what are the terms and conditions, and both the parties don't understand them clearly, there will be issues, and as we have seen in the Bangalore airport link. Now in suburban rail, we are supposed to go with the PPP operator for rolling stock, but that is still a long way. We are still in the implementation of the tracks, etc. It would take some time. So I have 2 points here to make. Is number one, very fine enough, you may kind of advocate PPP because many cities are experiencing with it, but do give the states a choice, because within the state there could be different systems and different levels of acceptance, or different levels of maturity, or different levels of being in a position to take PPP or anything forward. Similarly, within the state, there may be cities where we would like to try PPP. In other cases, we may not want to try. We may want to simply invest on public bus, strengthening the bus transport system. So the Government of India scheme, whatever it is, should give us this option. They should not give us one size fits all kind of a model, because that doesn't work out in Indian context. They can say this is there, and you can also try out this, and which could mean that we can try out PPP in areas where we are comfortable with, and maybe in the smaller cities where we don't see many people coming in, we could leverage the Government of India funding and strengthen the bus system. This I feel is important, because I think the focus only on metropolitan cities, etc., should go. The focus should be on smaller cities, because Indian cities are all growing. So it cannot be simply limited to cities at the scale of Bengaluru. Though the problems of such cities attract a lot of attention, we need to focus on smaller cities and put in public proper transport system. So that is one ask, that Government of India doesn't really prescribe something, but gives us the flexibility to try out various models in our states. The second ask is be consistent in this program. See, last time we had the bus funding scheme, if you are aware of it. and many of our cities kind of availed bus funding, and suddenly it was scrapped. So the state government had to bear the burden of, because we are halfway through and some buses have been procured and they're put in place. Then when it was suddenly scrapped, then we had to go back to the state and ask state to provide money from the budget and so on. So if you are going to have any scheme, that scheme should have a longer plan period. It cannot be like, you do something now and then you change. I understand with learnings, we need to modify the scheme, but the broad contours of the scheme that Government of India wants to support the public transport system and is willing to kind of provide support to the state, that broad framework should continue, not that, in between it gets scrapped and some other new scheme comes in, and then there has to be consistent, continuous funding for public bus systems in the country. So that is the second point I just wanted to make. Any other point I will add later on. Thank you, Amit.
Thanks a lot, ma'am. It's nice to hear that the government of Karnataka is really concentrating on buses as backbone for the overall transportation. So congratulations on that. Let me just bring in two important people in this conversation. First, Mr. Prasanna Patwardhan, and then Mr. Sayam Gandhi from Chartered. So, Mr. Prasanna, what's been your experience in city bus operation? And why do you think PPP are succeeding or not succeeding in city bus operation? And the same question will also go to Sayam Gandhi as well. So first, Mr. Prasanna, over to you.
Thank you, Amit. And let me say that I'm working in this field for last now almost 2006 onwards, about 15 years in PPP in different cities. And I have a mixed experience in different cities. But presently, I must say that it has been evolving, particularly after NGOs like yourself started interacting with cities and making people aware about importance of public transport. It has certainly changed, and after JNRM particularly, it changed quite a lot. But still, there are many lacunas, and we need to look at them. And at present, I am really very happy that a person like Mr. Bagde, who actually comes from the field, he is actually driving this scheme. So I'm sure this scheme will certainly be more successful. And a person like Mr. Shashi Verma is guiding government, who has a lot of experience in public-private partnership. And in fact, he has said a lot of the things which I wanted to say. So there is very little for me to say, but still I would like to say, divide my talk into two different areas. First is why PPP? Because many people think that why PPP when government services are doing well in certain areas of the country. So first thing, many times when we talk about PPP for investment purpose. That is, of course, a very important parameter, because unless when government has limited funds, might as well leverage that fund for a better use, which I believe is for giving viability gap funding and not for buying buses. Because for buying buses, private operator can buy buses and he can not only leverage his own equity, but also leverage a debt through banks. So if you have 100 rupees, you can actually invest 1,000 rupees. So that is how you can leverage your money. So government money should be utilized in an area where it is more important to make this system sustainable and not to just start the system. So that is a good thing which Mr. Bagde initially mentioned. So that is going to happen, I'm sure. Second is when we talk about costs. So how do we bring down cost? So first is labor cost, which is quite high in STUs. For any old organization, it is not only STU. Even when private organizations become old, then their salaries of staff keeps on growing. Whereas if you keep on recruiting staff, which is after 5 years or 6 years, which is a fresh staff, market value of that particular staff is say X. Say for example, in case of drivers, say today fresh driver you will get at 20,000 rupees, whereas same driver with almost same skill set, with same skill sets and probably with less efficiency because he gets fatigued, he gets aged. So he is getting about 50,000, 60,000 rupees for a job which he is doing against 20,000 rupees. So PPP contracts being a short-term contracts like 5 years, 7 years, 8 years, or even 10 years, your labor cost is going to remain limited compared to your overall cost. That is one. Second, in private, it has been observed that because of close monitoring, your other costs also will certainly come down. Your vehicles will be better maintained. And when I say better maintained, it is not only because it is private or public. There is a difference in only maker and maker doing everything, and whereas you have maker and checker. In case of STUs, when I'm doing everything, if anything goes wrong, there is no checker. So there is nobody else to check, control your quality, nobody else who will ensure that certain quality is delivered. Whereas in PPP, since there are two different parties, everything gets documented. And particularly with technology, documentation will become very, very easy. So you have each and every activity which is being tracked. And when it is being tracked, it becomes very easy to rectify. So this difference of maker and checker will also keep a PPP on the right track. Rather than one person doing everything, he is the maker and he is the checker. Third thing which I say is in public-private partnership, your budget is fixed. So if you say that I'm going to pay 60 rupees per kilometer or 50 rupees per kilometer or whatever that cost may be, you can budget for 5-7 years how much cost I am going to spend on operating of vehicles. That may not be the case when you are operating by yourself in government. Your fuel average may come down, your labor cost may go up, your maintenance cost may go up, or there are multiple reasons by which your cost may go up. But in public-private partnership, apart from your fuel, which is a very dynamic pricing, your most of the cost will be under control because you are entered into contract. And lastly, you get a lot of flexibility. Flexibility in terms of changing technology, flexibility in terms of changing operator, flexibility in terms of changing number of buses going up and down. So that flexibility also you get in public-private partnership. So in that sense, public-private partnership will become more successful going forward, and you can leverage strengths of private and public in terms of getting quality of service upgraded also. When it comes to my experience of running public-private partnership schemes, first and foremost is in many locations where we work under state transport undertakings, most of the people, they look at it as threat to their job. And that is why under STUs, public-private partnership is not becoming very successful, because the premise on which that partnership is working is not on the basis of real partnership. It is on the basis of I am the principal and you are the contractor. And when you are a contractor, whipping you becomes really very easy. So that concept of real public-private partnership is missing. That is one of the reasons. The way contracts are designed, the contracts are designed in a peculiar way. So you have very multiply, even in contracts which are designed by even experts, at the end of the contract, you will see one line added, wherein it will be said that final decision or changes, any changes in above contract is a prerogative of managing director or chairman of the company. So when that one line is written, there is no meaning to other contract points. And that is what is happening in many of the cases. Third thing which is important to make this contract successful is what kind of infrastructure is willing to share or which is readily available. This is slowly changing. I have worked on muddy grounds also, but find good infrastructure. So I'm happy that infrastructure, from that point of view, we have come a long way. So you get good infrastructure. So infrastructure readiness is a second important issue. Choosing the right kind of partner is also important. Vision budgeting or budgeting of the expenditure. I have not seen any business plan or budget of many SQs or even SPVs when they take out tender for 5 years or 7 years. How I am going to pay operator, what would be my income, what is my expenditure, and how I am going to bridge that gap between income and expenditure. So that kind of business plan, I have not seen ready in any of the organizations where at least I have worked, or it is at least not shown to me. So that is important when you are tendering something, when somebody else is putting money in a faith that you will pay him on time and you will make him your partner. It is important that you yourself understand what kind of money I need to spend in next 5 to 7 years. And that is also one of the lacking area. And because of which operators are not being paid on time months. Sometimes in this particular period, there is one STU wherein we have not been paid for last 18 months, not even a single penny, wherein my monthly expenditure or my monthly bank obligation is 1 crore per month. So under such circumstances, how people will survive? So it is important because it is very important to understand that if your operator is unable to provide quality service, your quality is going to go down. Your name is going to be spoiled. And when name of public transport gets spoiled, public will not come to public transport. And when public will not come to public transport, we enter into vicious cycle again. So your losses will keep on growing. So to avoid that, what Mr. Shashi Verma told repeatedly, dispute resolution mechanism is very, very important. And timely dispute resolution mechanism. Some of my arbitrations are going on for the last 5 to 6 years with no results in sight. So this kind of dispute resolution mechanism, even if it exists, it is of no use. So timely dispute resolution mechanism is also very, very important. Apart from that, there are many small things like fines or penalties, the way they are levied on operator, that also kills operators. So with this, I will stop here because there are other speakers also, because I can keep on talking, you know. So I will hold my speech here and I will listen to other people. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Prasanna. So let me bring in Sayam. Sayam, your experience, and also if you could highlight what happened during that lockdown period when the COVID was at, how did you then manage? What was your experience since you had been working with many cities on public-private partnership for bus operations?
Yeah, so good morning all. Chartered Speed actually was born with PPP. In fact, our first operations were in PPP in Ahmedabad. We started with the DRT buses that are now famous all across India for the really good corridor and really good operations all across India. So we have close to 1,100 vehicles and 800 of those are operated in PPP, may it be city buses or also intercity buses. And we also work in last mile mobility. So we have 5,000 bicycles and e-bikes, which help for last mile connectivity in 5 cities. And, you know, we have continuously talked about the good PPP operations in India, which is Surat, Ahmedabad, Indore, and they are one of our biggest, you know, PPP operations. And in fact, we are one of the leading service providers for them from day one. My experience and our company's experience has been very good in PPP. In the last 10 years, we have scaled up and invested close to $70 million just as a single company. You know, the mobility sector in India is very fast growing. And, you know, since we have this platform, it would be an open invite to investors all across the world that you come and invest in India in transportation, in buses, because you can really invest a lot of money because it is growing at such a fast rate. To cities as well, implement bus systems, especially in PPP. I would especially like to talk to Manjula ma'am about this. You know, you have considered that some cities may require to continue their government operations and some cities can start with PPP. But the example of Ahmedabad is similar to the one you were talking about. In fact, EMTS is a government-run city bus service founded in 1940. And for about 70 years, they worked as a government body. They scaled up to 1,000 buses very quickly. in around 1980s or 1990s is when they were at 1,000 buses, when the population was of Ahmedabad was half of what it is today, and it has stayed at 1,000. Even today, it is at 1,000 vehicles. But what they've done in the recent years, in the last 10 years, they have started to phase out the vehicles, and of the 1,000, only 100 now are owned by the government. So 900 are owned by private operators. They have phased out their staff, allocated them to other positions. And this is a very successful transition from government to private. Why, you would ask? When they were operating these buses, their cost of just manpower was around 100 rupees per kilometer. And we operate the buses with a healthy profit margin at 50 rupees, including everything, including the cost of the new bus, including the cost of operations. Now you would, there's a stark difference in just the labor cost versus what we require. And it's a no-brainer. So even though some of the operations may be efficient today, you have to look at 20 years down the line or 15 years down the line, and whether or not there will be the same kind of management that there is in maybe good cities, like good public transport cities like Bangalore or other cities in Karnataka. Another way to look at it, it's not a loss-making process at all. When we consider the gap between revenue and what kind of cost it takes, it's around 40 to 50%. So 50% of the revenue can be, of the cost can be collected in terms of ticket revenue. And when you look at the amount of taxes that we are paying, when you look at our cost, about 60% of it is taxes. So essentially, you are actually making a profit while running buses. 60% of the taxes go to center, then come back to the state, and then come back to the city. So it's just a laundry. You do not consider this as a loss-making proposition at all, because 60% of the taxes are what is funding the entire bus system. And when you invest in maybe one flyover, which costs you around 100 crore rupees, you can operate 600 buses for a year. That is, that's a huge impact for the city compared to just one flyover. Particularly, our experience in PPP has been good till date. We have had very good management in all these three cities. The authorities have been very active. They have been consulted by good consultants. There is, they continuously take feedback on what they're doing right, what they're doing wrong. And I think that is why there has been some success in PPP in all these three cities, especially during this lockdown period as well. I would like to give the example of Ahmedabad. So our contractual obligation of the city to pay us in case of non-operation of buses was around 15%. So they had to pay us 15% of the total cost, because it turned out to be the cost that they had calculated at the time of the tender to be the fixed cost, the cost of the EMIs. But looking at the costs of the conductors, of the drivers, of the other fixed costs of electricity and things like that, which have escalated over time, which have escalated over the 5-6 years, they paid more than what was in the contract. They paid 30% of the total cost. And that is why we could sail through the entire pandemic. And if you don't do things like this, I mean, if you stick by the book, and if they had paid us, for example, just 15%, or tried to find other clauses to not pay us, then there would have been no, there have been no buses running today. And all of the buses are now 100% operational in Ahmedabad. And it's only because they could, recognize the problems of the private operator and recognize that they are an important partner. And which is why, we could sail through the entire pandemic. The same we have seen in other cities as well. I would like to talk about a particular innovation in PPP. There are several innovations in all these three cities. All the models are totally different. In Ahmedabad, we procured the bus, we operated the bus, and we continue to operate them. In Surat, the chassis was bought by the corporation, the body was built by us, and then we operate. And for example, Indore. Now, Indore has a specific kind of a model where, as Sir pointed out earlier, Secretary Sir, that intercity buses, they make they make a profit, which is why STUs try to run those intercity buses. In MP particularly, there is no STU per se for the entire state. So they give out routes, intercity routes on royalty. So you pay a certain amount of royalty to ply a certain intercity route. Now, what they understood is that, you know, we are taking money for private operators to run buses on these intercity roads, and then we are paying operators money to run buses on the city bus routes. So they clubbed it into a single tender, and they have close to, I mean, we operate close to 400 buses for them in a similar kind of a model where we don't pay any royalty for the intercity buses. And that sets off some part of the viability gap funding that we need to run the city buses. In fact, we run 40 electric buses at just electricity cost, at just the cost of electricity, nothing else in the city of Indore. So they clubbed the intercity route with the electric buses. And that's how at just 7 rupees a kilometer, which is the electricity cost, they're able to run 40 electric buses. I mean, of course, it comes in with the DHI and FAME subsidy, which is why the buses are kind of free of cost to the city. But it is the kind of innovation PPP which can be, you know, taken a look at in all other cities in India. And thank you, Amit. That's all from my end.
Thanks a lot, Sayam, for highlighting some successful examples of PPP, and especially this whole innovation, especially on the lockdown phase, that was really kind of critical for you to kind of sail through during this difficult phase. So let me move forward, and maybe I'll probably bring in Vivek Chandran from Shakti Sustainable Energy Foundation. Vivek, my question to you is, when you talk about PPP, there is always a debate on net cost versus gross cost. And I heard once Mr. Prasanna say that in net cost, I don't make money, in gross cost, I lose money. So what has been your experience on net cost versus what gross cost? And is there any recommendation that Shakti has on cities to go for which kind of model?
Thanks, Amit. I think just to start with, I think I just wanted to say that this is a great step in the right direction. We have, for the first time after JNURM, a large enough scheme that can actually make a difference for bus transport in India. And from that point of view, I think we have to congratulate the central government for the vision, and also Mr. Bagbe for kind of championing this work and taking it forward. Our support to you, sir, from in any way that can provide. On the question that you asked, Amit, on gross costs or net cost, I think I would like to kind of go back to what Mr. Shashi Verma and Dario were saying, right? I think we need to get the principles right. And once we get the principles right and the accountability and incentive mechanisms that need to be established, I think then we get a system that starts working. And so to a large extent, if you look at why PPP, the push here is for more buses, right? That's the real beauty of PPP. We can get in resources, we can get in innovation, and as a result, get more public transport out there. And so from that point of view, if you look at how PPP is helping us meet the challenge of resources itself, it is one, upfront cost reduction, because we're getting in finance into the equation from private players. We are also increasing accountability and improving the incentive structure, separating the functions of planning, separating the functions of operation and that of regulation, which has also been discussed to an extent. We are bringing in private involvement also from the point of view of increasing options for the government, right? There are not going to be one, hopefully we don't end up creating a monopoly of sorts in operators as well, but the options are going to increase, and that's going to be something that government can use. And of course, from the other point of distributing risks, reducing the burden of innovation to an extent from government and moving some of that to the experts from the industry, from operators who know what technology is like and who know far more closely what that technology is about. I think if these are the principles which we use, then it's easier to kind of determine what model that we want, right? And to an extent, I think it's been proved to quite a bit that government needs to ensure that the interest of the public is taken care of. And from that viewpoint, the gross cost model makes more sense, right? Because then the first and important factor of success is that the government does the planning, right? We determine what, the government determines what needs to be the standard that public gets. And so they become protectors of the standard. To an extent, the regulator is also required to make sure that, you know, government promises are also kept and that they continue to deliver on what they claim. But we could get to that at a later point. But I think that's the important aspect there, that government and the public transport authority of sorts becomes the planner. There are challenges there. I don't think that kind of capability exists. It's not seen in every authority. It needs to be built. Capacity needs to be built. And if you're talking about an all India scheme, these are sometimes models that have not even been seen in some states, right? So a lot of capacity building and, you know, getting in the right kind of you know, skills into these authorities will become important. Of course, the second problem, I think, is the funding and financing. And of course, that's the important and most important aspect, that the government needs to ensure that there is revenue streams coming in, right? And if we can, you know, remove the operational burdens from the STU, and then they can start thinking about how to get financing and funding in place, I think that's a huge favor that we can do to our the staff and STUs. Because then they're looking at how do we get the service running and keep it running, and that's the only prerogative that they have. So that becomes the second level where this is a reform, right? So and maybe two other points perhaps on contract management. Again, an area that STUs have not really succeeded very well, because I think Prasanna sir had talked about it, Shashi Verma sir also talked about it. You know, keeping to contracts and keeping to the standards becomes the biggest challenge. Writing those contracts itself is a big challenge. Writing those SLAs, and what are those SLAs going to kind of determine? How do you make it outcome based, and how can you track it using data that you can get now with technology and innovation? That is still a challenge, but we need to crack it, and I think it can be cracked, because that's the whole charm of PPP. If you look at Delhi as an example, DIMS. The data of DIMS buses are out there. It's on Google, all of these platforms. To a large extent, we still did not see the DTC data out there. I think that's proof that the system works, and the incentives are to an extent in the right place. And I think I just want to touch upon one more thing. PPP need not only be in operations, it can also be in infrastructure, right? Terminals and depots are still something that, you know, Indian cities haven't gotten right. And terminals, I know Prasanna sir just said we have worked in mud, land which has mud on it, right? And that continues. It is the norm to a large extent. It's just a field on which buses park. And we need to change that. And that can also change using innovative models of bringing in private sector players who know what design is about, who know how to execute it. And we've succeeded in airports, and now we're looking at it in railway stations. So I'm sure we can get it done. And I think lastly, of course, when we get in public and private kind of partnership, the regulator, I think, is very, very important. And we've been doing some work on this in the past, where we looked at how do you differentiate the actions that each of the players take? How do you determine that? And then what role the regulator plays? I think UITP did a great job of providing some insights on that from experiences in Europe. And I think that's going to become very important as well, because who's going to dispute resolution? That becomes a problem. Who's going to be fair about this is the second issue. And how do we continue to determine that the consumer's interests are kept in mind while all of this happens? I think that becomes the other issue. So to conclude, I think we need to get our first principles right. So why are we doing this? We need more public funding. I think that's most important. We need to make sure that schemes such as these continue. And I think Manjula ma'am also said that we need to make sure it continues into the future. How do we strengthen capacity of our transport undertakings? That's important. Getting a neutral regulator, expand service delivery, private sector itself and the capabilities in this, because that's something we need to do for the long run. It's not going to happen in 1 or 2 years. We shouldn't be expecting success immediately. I think Shashi Verma sir kind of pointed out to that. that it took what 20, 30 years to get it right, and now they're succeeding. Right? And I think the patience is another thing that we need to learn about. And maybe this is a long-term reform, and so we should probably be a little bit patient on getting it right. Thanks.
Thanks, Vivek. Absolutely. So on that front, let me request Mr. Gautam Patel to share his insight. Especially Gautam, if you could talk a little bit more about the contracting bit, and that's probably the heart of the conversation.
Yeah, sure, Amit. Very much for this opportunity, and congratulate WRI for the 18th Connect Karo Bus Karo program and having such a wonderful panel here. A lot of what I would have wanted to say has already been said. So, especially Mr. Shashi Verma's, presentation was a wonderful, exercise in giving clarity. I'll not repeat, and I'll focus on the thing which you pointed out, Amit. Well, as somebody who has been involved in writing PPP contracts over the last 15 years, I would like to make a few points. But before I come to that, I just want to make one very important point. Before I accidentally ended up in the field of public transport and writing PPP contracts, and in that area, I was working in the field of PPPs in energy and roads, and the PPPs in those sectors in India started much earlier than PPPs in public transport. So energy, started in 90s, and even the roads, and our road sector PPPs became one of the largest PPP programs in the world. And that there are learnings from there, because what we have now is that the PPP, the experience of those two sectors has been mostly missed. It has not been entirely a success story there also. And we have a lot of disputes which are lying in different tribunals and courts, and outstanding payments with the governments. And so there's one point I want to very strongly make, is that if there is one central learning that has come out of the PPPs of other sectors, which I feel is not sufficiently appreciated in the urban transport sector, when we're talking about PPPs, is that we must, when we have contracts being executed between the private sector and the government, we must make both parties capable of executing those contracts. And unless you do that, fundamentally, your contracts are bound to be, wobbly. They're bound to, get into disputes. You will not have complete delivery. What I mean by capabilities, for example, we have seen a plethora of generation of PPP contracts. Even right now, MOHUA has a model contract on its website. DHI has another model contract. We have seen that as the contracts progress, different generations brought in elements of standard practices within PPP. For example, the latest generation of electric bus contract by DHI, which has been written by Niti Aayog, that has an element of very strong payment mechanisms to the operator, which is a very welcome thing. It also has a very strong element of bankability, where the contract becomes bankable. You can take that contract to the bank and say, look, I have entered into this contract, please provide me funding. Now, this is all very good. Similar thing was done in the power sector. What the problem that led was that while you had bankable contracts, you did not have bankable institutions which were backing those contracts. While an STU would very much like to pay an operator, very often they simply don't have funds. I know cities like Ludhiana, which went into a GCC, but they had simply not planned for any payments, and they just could not find the money to pay. So we must have a mechanism where the institutions which are entering into these PPP contracts must have the money, must have the bankability and the credibility themselves. In Ahmedabad, it has been relatively successful. Sayam pointed out, one of the reasons is that the Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation and the municipal corporations in Gujarat, they all are financially very strong. For example, AMC has a AA plus rating, which is just a notch below the best AAA. So if you have bankable, creditable, financeable institutions, then you will have PPP strong. In power sector, this happened that power purchase agreements were written between private producers of power, which they sold to the state electricity boards. The state electricity boards had no money to pay the private producers of power, and therefore the PPPs began to wobble. and they have had a mixed experience there. So in order for this not to happen, let us strengthen the STUs in terms of their funding capability by providing them long-term, multi-year commitment financing commitments to the state level, which is there in TFL. So that's the limited point there. In terms of the contracts for the schemes which is coming up, I would like to have a few, make a few suggestions to Bagre sir since he's here. Based on my experience, sir, the target for the new scheme is very ambitious. It is 18,000 to 20,000 buses. This kind of scale, if we would have to, really put those buses on the roads, we'll have to have a very flexible contract. We'll have to have a very flexible scheme. The experience of, the electric bus contracts under FAME 1 and FAME 2 is that we have not been able to, even complete 50% of the committed outflow of buses. So in order to do that, let us make a scheme and a contract where you have flexibility in terms of the coverage, the type of where the buses can fly. Let them fly not only in urban but also on the semi-urban routes and the cities which are connecting the main city. 2, flexibility in the bus type. Let there be buses selected of all types, sizes, floor heights, AC, non-AC, so that the city is able to decide what kind of buses it wants. And let there be flexibility in terms of whether the city wants it fully built or custom built, because in custom building, there is a cost saving. There are a lot of people who don't like it, but there is a cost saving. The STUs love custom built because there's an employment and there is an ecosystem issue also. So that is another flexibility. Let there be flexibility in fuel types in terms of, CNG, diesel or electric. Let the cities choose that. Let the contracts be flexible. Let there be flexibility in business models, because we are married to gross cost. We have been in CEPT University, have been promoting GCC all these years, but there is a time we need to move on from GCC to, like Mr. Verma said, quality incentive contracts. We need to have leasing models in electric buses. We need to have, we should be able to live with outright purchase plus AMC, annual maintenance contract kind of arrangements, because a lot of STUs are still only comfortable with outright purchase. And that is one of the reasons they were very, very cautious and apprehensive in the FAME 2 electric bus. So let there be flexibility there. Let there be flexibility in CAPEX and OPEX, because cities STU should be able to select whether they want to fund CAPEX or whether they want to fund OPEX. And there are financial methods where you can translate CAPEX funding into OPEX funding in a very, very viable and very balanced manner. So you can have in that, my suggestion is that if you can, instead of funding a percentage of the bus cost, please stipulate a absolute amount, like say, for example, 25 lakh per bus for a standard bus. So you just say this is the amount. The rest of the money has to be managed by the state and the STU. So if that is the kind of stipulation, it will help them to try and minimize their own contribution by having better tenders, better contracts, better support to the operator. So let that be. There are other points, sir, which Mr. Bagre mentioned about the ITS and fare collection. Sir, my request is let Government of India come out with a standardization of ITS, just like we have in buses, UPS2, AIS 052, CMVR. Let there be standardized specifications for ITS, which will go a long way in helping STUs procure ITS. And the last point I want to make is the contracts are already very strong, strong on many areas, but performance parameters, quality incentives, SLAs, they still need an improvement. And there are a variety of ways which it can be done, including in terms of, linking them to the ITS, which has not yet been done. So those are my points, Amit. Sorry if I took a little longer.
Thanks a lot, Gautam. Especially two important things: flexibility. I think that's one. And then how can we create a central contract to move forward?
Thank you.
Okay. So let me just move quickly, and we are already slightly behind schedule, but maybe let's bring in Rupa Nandi from UITP. Rupa, if you'd like to share your experience, UITP's experience on this topic, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, sure, Amit. We have some experience in India as well as in global locations. So what we have seen I think a lot has already been explained here by various experts. One of the key things that one should look at when you talk of PPP is balancing between social and commercial route. See, one thing we cannot, cannot really ignore, that a private operator is there to make some gains. And whenever a city outsources its routes to a private operator, whether it is through an NCC or a GCC, they forget that there has to be a balance that has to be maintained. Secondly, one of the key things which is leading to, let's say, DIMS's success is technology. They are able to maintain all the SLAs. They have a very good payment schedule. The private operators do not face any kind of financial challenges as such. So these are some of the things that you need to look at. Secondly, another thing which Manjula ma'am also indicated is that we shouldn't ask a city that, okay, GCC is the model and you should go for it. I think if a city, a small one, and they have technical expertise, but they lack financial expertise, they don't have that much of funding, they should definitely consider NCC. But let's say if there are cities which have a financial as well as a technical competency, but they want to bring some efficiency in the system, then GCC is probably something which they should look at. Similarly, I think that whether it is a small city or a big city, both should consider some amount of privatization. In case of small cities, like as rightly pointed out, maybe Madhya Pradesh, we don't have a strong STU in place. And maybe in those places, the PPPs would really work. Whereas in cities like Bangalore or other cities which have a very good STU functioning already, we should keep it in the hands of the already existing operator, that, okay, this is the portion that we should be operating and this is the portion that should be outsourced to a private operator for various reasons. It could be efficiency, it could be maybe a private operator has a scope of better fleet expansion or so. So these are some of the points that we should look for. Secondly, contracts that has already been stressed upon by many. One of the key Indian specific challenges is competing with paratransit, and that I think needs to be tackled at a city authority level. That how do we take paratransit as a last and first mile connectivity and not really a competing paratransit, competing mode for the private operator, to make sure that they also keep the services as have been planned. Yeah, that's it from me.
Thanks a lot, Rupa, for some great insight on this topic. So before we close and move to question and answer, let me bring in Raghavendra. Raghavendra, you are from Ashok Leyland, one of the leading manufacturers of buses. What's your take on this topic?
Yeah, while most of the eminent speakers have already covered most of the topics, like from an OEM perspective, right? Like we also have experience in diesel and CNG with the operators as well. And of late in electric vehicles, we have directly participated in some of the GCC contracts and we are into operations. We have successfully covered around 30 lakh kilometers plus in Ahmedabad and recently started in Bihar and likely to start in Chandigarh. So few of the points, just two of the points I'd like to cover, which can improve wider tender participation and making these contracts bankable, right? So first is on the penalties. So for instance, most of these PPP contracts, unlike of the very good STUs in terms of successful PPP, this penalty is being taken as more of a way of revenue generation rather than more of performance enhancement or KPI monitoring. So for instance, good STUs like DIMS and others, they make it highly IT enabled and there is no kind of dispute between the kind of penalty parameters. And also some of the penalties have been used also for incentivizing. If you over exceed the target, there should also be, while on one side you are penalizing, there should be standard incentives for overachieving the KPI targets, which will also help in wider tender participation. And one final point is on the deliveries need to be tied up with infrastructure readiness. that is off late we have seen, especially in electric vehicles, where the readiness of the depot and the charging infrastructure and the allied civil infrastructure need to be in place. Unlike diesel, maybe little more relevant as well in CNG. Unless the infrastructure is in place, even if the vehicle is being delivered, you don't actually start kicking off the project, and the revenue doesn't start clicking for both the operator as well as the authority. So it is a lose-lose situation if such a thing happens. So while planning the tenders, also the required infrastructure need to be planned accordingly, so that both are tied up. So it's a win-win situation for both the tendering authority as well as the operator or the OEM. So these were the two limited points, while most of the other points on payments, collections, and others have been raised, so which are also equally important, because that will dictate which tenders people will tend to participate, right? Like, because otherwise through self-selection, only good STUs will attract participation, and there are other STUs with relatively less experience in PPP or poor track record in payments will not attract participation. So these are important pillars for wider acceptance of PPP throughout.
Thanks a lot, Raghavendra. Okay, so let's move to the Q&A. We got some number of questions, and we have a kind of a great collection of speakers. So my request would be to be short and precise to the answers. So my first question to Mr. Shashi Verma, there's a question that so you need strong institutions for PPP, like TFL is there, so you have such great PPP arrangement. But none of the cities in India have a TFL equivalent. So how can they go about doing a good PPP contract?
Well, look, you have to start with what you have. You can't imagine that you have a TFL sitting in every city in India. I think all of these solutions, we've worked very hard to try and land these solutions in an Indian context. Whether it's the STUs that become the nerve center of these kind of institutions, or whether state governments want to go and create new institutions, is really up to them. I would prefer that we don't go around creating new institutions, because in India we have this complexity of having too many institutions in the same space. But if it is the STUs, then I think the transformation that's needed there is big. STUs are very thinly managed right now, very, very thinly managed. And their management is really about running a day-to-day service. Expecting them to become contract managers overnight is a bit too much. And I think the point about capability building that has been made by many people today is absolutely important. I think this is one of the points that we make in our national bus program. There is the need to build capability and ongoing support for that. Can I just make a plug as well that Gerald Olivier from the World Bank, who we partnered with to work in India, is a huge player in this. He understands this inside out, and especially this context about capability building. So if you need advice, look him up, because he's been on the ground helping people, especially with this very complex task of how do we go around building capability.
Thanks a lot, Shashi. Dario, one question for you is that you have something called a trust fund. Can you just explain what is the trust fund? How does this help in operation?
Yes, one issue that has been raised is that the payment is done on time for the private operator according to rules that are set forth in the contract. So one of the schemes that was very, very successful was this creation of a trust fund that has the opportunity to be distributed according to the contract rules without all the processing that needs to go in a public agency for disbursement of payments. So it makes it very, very expedite and clear how to make it. And it is the trust fund collects all the revenues from the user fares and from the viability gap that is provided by government. So the money is there for payment on time, and there's a scheme for penalties and incentives on the side, but there's no issue with having the money to pay on time according to the service delivered.
Thanks a lot, Dario. And since Shashi mentioned about Gerald, there is a question, in fact, from Gerald. He's participating in the webinar. The question is for you, Gautam. And what Gerald is asking is that you talked about flexibility, but then how do you get economies of scale unless you have, so if your contracts are flexible, then isn't that restriction to get economies of scale?
Yes, so that's a very, very good question. I mean, the moment you say, all right, we are ready to live with a lot of variety. in terms of what different STUs want? Are we not kind of, having very customized, solutions? We then need very customized solutions, and does that, economies of scale? See, I will answer this in a very limited way by saying something very specific. You have certain very important principles in a contract, which must be honored in all contracts, which must be present in all contracts. By all means, have those incorporated in a standard contract. Or in fact, I don't like standard contracts. So I would say that let the government specify what those important things are, which must be part of any contract. Like Mr. Verma made a very important point about dispute resolution. So you must have a very good dispute resolution mechanism. Let those be there. But other than that, let the contracts be flexible in terms of the need. And it will not inhibit economies of scale, because you're going to ultimately deal with buses. And buses, like Mr. Raghavendra, there are only a few. There are not such a big variety. The variety will be in terms of business models and in terms of the other things. But in terms of the bulk of the in terms of the product and the service parameters, there may not be too much of difference, and therefore I feel it will not really be an inhibiting factor for economies of scale.
Thanks a lot, Gautam.
Yeah, thanks.
So very quickly, one last question, Vivek. You had something around blended finance. If you would like to elaborate, and then we'll probably bring this to close.
Yeah, so of late, again, with the focus of expanding and scaling public transport, we've been exploring what are the resource requirements, needed to make this expansion possible, especially in the long term. Amit, you've been part of this work. Also, we've been working to develop a tool that helps STUs kind of, look at what can be those different permutation and combinations with which they will need resources. So that's something that can again help long-term planning. But when exploring this, we realized the delta that finance can provide, especially when in a PPP mode, right? So when looking at PPP, where the private partners getting their finance will also impact your costs finally, because in the life cycle, it'll all accumulate. And so that's something to be looked at as well. And so when government is in a good position, one, of course, there is revenue coming in from taxes and other places, but is there a possibility to, for example, tie up with developmental banks like the World Bank and KfW? Those opportunities still need to be looked at and need to be taken, and then, a mechanism to blend those finances together and then provide it perhaps to the private operator in this case to reduce that long-term burden that eventually the government itself is going to have to pay, is something to look at. And so that's something important, because we've seen that when STUs today are operating and they do take loans from the states, they get it at much cheaper rates, right? And so that's going to be the next change that will happen when we start moving to a private operator who's funded by the market. And so they're getting money at a much higher rate as a result.
Thanks a lot, Vivek. So we are already behind schedule. So we have been close to 2.5 hours now. And I think if we get another 2.5 hours, probably we can still continue the discussion. That's the beauty of this topic and the subject. So first of all, I'd like to thank everyone for participating. And for the final closing, I will request our CEO, Dr. O.P. Agarwal, to conclude this session. O.P., sir, over to you.
Thanks, Amit. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. We can hear you and see you as well.
Thanks. I'm sorry I was sort of incognito for a while, but I heard a lot of the discussions and fascinating. It's also a delight to see so many friends on this. On my screen, I see Dario, Shashi, Vivek, Gautam, Prasanna, and of course, Mr. Bagre and Manjula. It's been a delight. It's been a delight. And whatever discussions I heard, they were really fascinating. I have views on each of them, but I won't go into that. Time is really short. But the one big piece that I would like to mention in all this is, it is really a time and an opportunity for us to completely transform bus services in the country. So far, we've been running a kind of service which is low quality, aimed at people who have no other option except to use buses. affordability has been the biggest concern. And so we've tended to run a fairly quality bus service all this while. It really needs to now transform to be able to attract people who have the option of personal motor vehicles or paratransit into buses. And this is the opportunity that Mr. Bagre has through this huge grant from the government of India to look at a massive modernization of the services. And PPPs, to my mind, are one critical element in making that improvement. We cannot continue running buses in the country the way we have been doing over the last 50 years, or 70 years rather. It really has to change. I think a number of suggestions were made about capacity building. I think this is an exercise we should take up through WRI, put up a really solid capacity building program. I think we have the abilities within WRI to do it. We have a lot of partners whom we can tap for this. This is something I would strongly recommend that we take up. And other than that, just wanted to thank everyone. Fascinating. I enjoyed the discussions. With that, Amit, let me pass it back to you. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Thanks a lot, OP sir, and thanks for taking this session while sitting at the airport. So thanks a lot. I think before we close, I think this the new upcoming bus funding scheme is a fantastic opportunity. MoHUA has already been in consultation with many leading institutes on framing this scheme right. We hope that the new scheme which will come in will be a game changer of sorts. And I think that's where we would also like to help and contribute from our side. But we hope that with this discussion, we can also kind of bring back the already important concept of public transport, basically bus-based public transport in the conversation, as well as seeing how can we add more buses. And as OP sir said, that it's not only about adding more buses in the city, but it is how do you add more quality buses in the city. So what will it take? And I think that's where I am very excited that this bus funding scheme will play the catalyst for reviving public transport in India. Before we close, as I said, this is the 18th bus Karo, and this would have not been possible without the generous support we have received over the years from Shakti, Sustainable Energy Foundation, and FedEx, along with other partners. So I really like to thank them. And once again, I thank everyone for joining this discussion today, and we hope to see you in the 19th event as well. For now, thank you and see you soon.
Thank you, Amit.